And welcome to Climate Chat. I'm your host, Dan Miller. And today we'll be sort of continuing our discussion on the um, psychological and other and social factors that are impacting our ability to address climate change. In some ways, I think this is the most important subject we can talk about because we talk about climate science and it's extremely clear that we need to take urgent and dramatic action to address climate change right away with no waiting. And we also know through our other discussions that we have plenty of climate solutions available to get started on scaling, for example, a clean energy transition and moving industrial processes over to green solutions and all of that. We know we don't have everything we need, but we certainly have all we need to get started at a rapid rate. And so, given those two things, that we know that if we don't act immediately, we will face unacceptable consequences in the future, and I mean unacceptable. And we know we can do it, and yet we're doing virtually nothing. And so that's a really interesting situation. And while I've seen a lot of discussion about individual reasons for this. And by the way, we did a show on optimism bias, which is one of many reasons why we're not acting. We did a whole show on that a few weeks ago, or a month ago or so. I've never actually seen a collection where someone talks about all of the reasons all at once. And by the way, if you're aware of that, please post it in the comments so I can go look it up. But this is a list I'll be discussing today is a list I put together myself. And the reason I did this is because I put together a list of climate actions we should be taking. I made it a 20-point plan. You could look up that show. We did a whole show on that. And I realized that all of these actions we could do tomorrow. There were not things that are even difficult to do in a practical sense, although politically, obviously, it's very challenging now. But when I thought about, like, wait, we could do this, we need to do this, and we're not doing it. Why is that? And that's where this list of what I called barriers to climate action. I did a show 2 years ago on barriers to climate action. There's a link in the description to that. And there's also a link to the optimism bias show we did a month or so ago. And so I'm going to go through these again in a sort of a different way today. And again, I think this is really the most important thing, because if we can actually figure this out, which is not easy, by the way, probably a lot harder than coming up with climate solutions, clean energy and things like that. That's easy in comparison to the psychological and social challenges here that I'll be discussing today. But in some sense, they're easy. We could, become rational all of a sudden, and then we could just do these things. But that's going to be tough. But let's jump in to this. Oh, before I do jump in, let me just quickly say that on March 8th, so next Sunday, we have Eugene Kirpitrov, who's the head of a website called Work on Climate. I think this is going to be really interesting for a lot of our listeners. It's a website where you can collaborate on climate solutions. You can find a job, you can find collaborators and mentors and things like that, and actually do a whole bunch of things, find out about events going on. And it's actually the largest collection of people working on climate in an online community. So that's on March 8th and March 15th. I'm also very excited. Allison Taylor, who's an NYU professor who specializes in business ethics and sustainability, is going to be talking to us. And we're going to be obviously focusing on companies and what they're doing and not doing to address climate. So that's the next 2 Sundays coming up. So with that, let's jump in to why we choose to fail on climate action. And before we jump in there, again, one more thing, please like and subscribe. The whole idea is to inform people about the challenges we face with climate change. The more people that hear that, the better. And you can help do that by liking and subscribing. Leaving a comment in the video as well is also very helpful for the algorithm to spread this message to more people. So really would appreciate that. So as I said, we're going to be talking about the choices we have, one of a bright future and one of a very dark future. and it's really up to us. And so far, we're choosing to fail. And what do I mean by choosing to fail? As I mentioned earlier, we climate science is very clear that we must act immediately to take action to lower emissions, for example, to remove past emissions and take other steps. And if we don't do that, we will face unacceptable, and by unacceptable, things like, collapse of civilization kind of things, which I would consider to be unacceptable by most people. There's a few people that think the sooner humans are out of here, the better. But putting that aside, I think that most humans would agree that collapsing civilization would not be a very fun thing to go through. Um, and I also mentioned that we have all the solutions we need to get started. We don't have everything we need, but we certainly have everything we need to get started. We could certainly replace all our electricity system with renewables very quickly, and we could transition the industrial emissions and heating over as well to clean solutions. Take a little more effort, but we can do these things. But we're doing almost nothing right now, which is kind of amazing. I mean, yes, we are doing, there's renewable energy is growing, but fossil fuel emissions are not dropping. And so in a sense, what we're doing is expanding the energy supply with renewables. And, the expansion of energy provides some social benefits. But when the problem is too much fossil fuel emissions, it would be much better to be replacing fossil fuel emissions with renewables rather than just growing the energy supply. And that's just one example of the things we're not doing. And so with that, let's jump into why we're failing to take the action that we need. And the reasons fall into different categories. And those categories include, and maybe the most important one is our brain. We think of ourselves as rational, but we're not rational. We evolved over millions of years. Humans only been around for maybe 300,000 years. And our brains evolved so we could survive, and it does certain things well and it does other things not so well. And certainly we didn't evolve over most of that time with a highly industrial society with fossil fuels and tremendous amounts of energy at our disposal. We were on the savannah trying to get some food for the day. So we'll get into those kinds of issues. Also, there's a whole set of issues around communications, around the media, and around education that have been failures on climate. The economic system we have and the incentive systems we built into our society are misaligned for the problem at hand. In fact, they're working against us for the most part there. We certainly have political failures, but essentially a total failure politically on climate. There's inertia in the system. We'll talk about this, but things like the incredible amount of fossil fuel infrastructure that's very hard to just turn off overnight and switch it. And then the big problem of the interest of a few versus the benefit of many. And that comes in different flavors. And then there's a sort of another miscellaneous category, which I just call other failures. And we'll get into that as well. But let's jump in. So let's see if I can make this a little easier to see for everybody by switching here. So human cognition biases and failures. So starting with the short-term thinking, it's very basic here. We grew up on the savannah in Africa hundreds of thousands of years ago. And back then, the two big questions you had were, what am I going to eat today? And what's going to try to eat me today? And anything else wasn't that important. Maybe you thought a couple of weeks out by, building your hut, or maybe putting some protections on your cave or something like that to make it a little more comfortable or protected. And so you thought a little bit out in the future there. But for the most part, it was everything you had to deal with was very short term. So our brains are wired to focus on immediate concerns. It's not designed to focus on long-term existential threats. And this shows itself when the people listening to this program very, very aware of climate, and you're aware of the long-term not even long-term, but medium-term existential threats it faces. But when you talk to people, you can sort of see them, their eyes glaze over, and it just usually doesn't get them very engaged. And it's because they're worried about they're going to work tomorrow, and paying the bills next week and things like that. And we're focused on near-term things. It's just the way we are. We have to recognize this and try to deal with it. Just like people who have if you have dyslexia or something like that, you learn to work around it, and you can be better reader than other people because you figured out how to work around it. This is one of those things we have to learn to work around and to focus on longer term threats. Now, another one is optimism bias. Did a whole show on optimism bias, and by the way, we could do a whole show on each and every one of the items in this presentation. Maybe, and in fact, if there's any in here that you would like me to go into more detail on another show, please put that in the comments as well. So I'm not going to go into optimism bias very much because we did a whole show on it, but just in very short, it's this is not for people who deny climate change, but people who believe in climate change, but just sort of to protect your mental state, you kind of assume that things will be okay. Or when you look at the range of possibilities, your brain is biased to look at the better outcomes and to assume the better outcomes, even though there's no reason to assume that things will be okay or the best outcomes will happen. And this is a big problem. Again, we spent a whole show on it, so go check that out. A link is in the description. The bystander effect is interesting. I actually experienced this directly, and I talk about this in my TEDx talk on climate, which I did in 2014. It's available. There's a link on the homepage of Climate Chat to it. It's not my video. It's a TEDx video, but I tell the story, and it's a true story. I was going to college, and I was going to visit a college, and I was at the Port Authority bus terminal in New York City to take a bus up to Cornell, where I was going to check it out. And while I'm waiting there, there's about 20 or 25 people standing on the platform waiting for the bus to come. And there were two guys talking near the curb. And as the bus pulls up, everyone could see that the bus's side mirror was about to whack the guy in the back of the head who wasn't facing the bus. And everybody just looked at him. And I was kind of far away, but it was pretty obvious. I could see everyone seeing it. And I thought, well, someone's going to pull him away or tell him something. And no one did. So I pushed through and I grabbed him and I pulled him away. And I thought that was really weird that, everyone saw it, like not everyone, but most people saw it. And anyway, that is a classic example of the bystander effect, where you figure there's other people around. And so if there's a problem, someone else will take care of it. So I don't have to step in. And that's a classic thing in climate change as well. Well, if it's a serious problem and everybody knows it, then people must be working on it, of course, so I don't have to pay attention. And that's not true. You got to step forward and do something. Also, speaking of my TEDx talk, I spent like a big chunk of time on human threat indicators. We grew up on the savannah, and we learned, there's so much information that we have that are hitting us all the time. We have to learn how to filter things out and focus on the things that are important to our survival. So what did we learn a couple 100,000 years ago, and as we were evolving? Well, we learned to focus on, I think, 6 things that are immediate, visible, have historical precedent, have simple causality, direct personal consequences, and are caused by an enemy. And we'll go quickly through those by comparing climate change to, let's say, a lion showing up in front of you all of a sudden. So in terms of immediate, the lion in front of you is very immediate right now. You must act, you must do something. And climate change is in the future. Okay, I'm not going to focus on that. I got to worry about immediate things. Visible, the lion's right in front of you. Climate change, I don't know, it's a nice day outside. You don't see it. You might see impacts, but they're a little disjoint from the actual cause. So immediate, visible, historical precedent. Hey, the lion ate your brother last week, so to watch out for lions. Climate change hasn't happened to this extent in human memory. Actually, we had ice ages and things, but we don't remember that very well. 20,000 years ago. Let's see, historical simple causality. Hey, lion's gonna bite your head off. You're gonna be dead. Very simple. Climate change is parts per million. It's climate sensitivity. It's Earth energy imbalance. I mean, all these things that people don't understand. Direct personal consequences. Lion's right in front of you, about to bite your head off. That's very personal. Climate change is affecting other people. Maybe someday it'll affect me, but not very clear. I think direct personal consequences and caused by an enemy. Well, the lion in this case is your enemy, and climate change is caused by all of us, so it's not a direct enemy. And the example I've given before, that just imagine that we find out tomorrow that all the excess CO2 in the atmosphere was being emitted by North Korea in order to destabilize the climate. And that's they had a big factory there pumping out that CO2 to destabilize the climate. The next day we would bomb them, and of course we're bombing other people today for no good reason. But that would be a good reason. But that's not the answer. That's not actually what's happening. The answer is we're doing it all ourselves, everyone, and not everyone, but all the developed world. And so it's none of these threat indicators that we grew up into to watch out for are being triggered, and that's a big problem. So let's move on to language framing. Is it climate change? Is it climate crisis? Climate catastrophe? And we call it an environmental issue with polar bears. Environmental issues are very far away. They're not the lion right in front of you kind of thing. And so even the language we use does not engage the public and to be concerned about what's happening. We have tribal identity issues. This goes back, again, to our evolution. We trust our inner group. And so if you're part of a group that says climate change isn't real, even though you can see it's clearly real, you're going to say it's not. And that's a problem we have, at least in the United States, quite a bit. Lack of systems thinking. This just people don't think in systems, but climate change is a big systems problem. Everything is interrelated. Did a whole show on this, by the way, which a lot of people liked. You have to go back at least a couple of years for that one, but you can search for it on Climate Chat, and you'll see a whole program on systems thinking. I was a systems engineer when I got out of college, and I learned working on communication satellites, and my job was to worry about the whole satellite, not a particular part. There were experts on each particular part, but I had to make sure that it all came together and it uses the right amount of power, and it wasn't too heavy. Each part, fit into the whole system. It really a fun and interesting job, and that's the kind of thinking that we need to address climate change. Misunderstanding of uncertainty and exponential, two different things, but we misunderstand both of them. We'll talk a little bit more about the uncertainty thing when we talk about risk. But the bottom line is people think that if things are uncertain, this gets back to optimism bias. If they're uncertain, that means we don't have to worry about them, right? Because if it was certain that we're going to, all die, then, maybe we should do something. But if there's only a 50% chance that we're going to die from climate change, then maybe there's a 50% chance we won't. But of course, you never would do that on an airplane, putting your kids on it. If there was more than a 1% or 0.1% chance of that plane crashing, you wouldn't put your kids on it. Yet all our kids are on this planet, and the risks are way higher than we would ever accept otherwise. So there's sort of a combination of all these biases on this page, even though the fact that we wouldn't accept that risk otherwise, we kind of put it out of our mind and accept it in this case. Now, in terms of exponentials, have a whole page on this. Just give hold on a second. Two examples of exponentials to show how our brain really isn't very good at this. So now we like to grow GDP. Each country tries to grow GDP, and 3% a year is a good target for how much we want to grow GDP. So let's assume that instead of this concept of GDP, starting 100, 200 years ago, why don't we assume that civilization started on this path 3,000 years ago, maybe in China somewhere. And back then, the entire output of humans on Earth was making 1 cubic meter of stuff. That was the entire output of the world 3,000 years ago. But each year it grew by 3%. Again, we're trying to get 3% GDP growth every year. So let's just say we did that for 3,000 years at 3% growth. How much stuff would we be making now? The question is, would it cover the surface of the Earth? And yes, it would, out to the orbit of Neptune. In other words, it would be a sphere of stuff whose diameter, and it's not a pancake, it's a sphere, a diameter was the size of the orbit of Neptune, about 8.6 billion kilometers wide ball of stuff. And obviously, we're not going to be making that on Earth. So it's not even theoretically possible to have infinite growth on a finite planet. It's not even theoretically possible. But let's take one that's, and that one is related to our economic system, but let's take one that's more directly related to climate change. And so if the total ice melt across the Earth contributed 1 millimeter to sea level rise today, and that's not far off, by the way. And let's say the rate of ice melt doubled every 10 years. And the range, I believe, for reality is somewhere between 5 and 20 years. How much would there of total sea level rise would there be in 100 years? And the answer is 10 meters or 33.6 feet of sea level rise in 100 years. And if you only looked at 75 years to the year 2100, it would be 2.6 meters or 8.5 feet. And so when people say, well, it's only contributing 1 millimeter a year, they always say that's fine. We're all fine. But exponentials are not your friend here, and that's why. And it's very hard for humans to grasp how rapidly they grow after a while, because exponential stays low, 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 and boom, all of a sudden it's huge. It grows very quickly. So those are two examples of exponentials, and the fact that we don't understand them very well. So let's talk about communications, media, and education. Well, when it comes to communication, there's a well-funded and well-coordinated disinformation campaign funded by fossil fuel companies and Russia and Fox News and others to convince people that climate change is not a problem. But there isn't any well-funded, well-coordinated campaign to inform the public about climate change. I mean, yeah, you can come to climate chat, but take a look at our numbers versus Fox News or something like that, and you'll realize that we're playing a small role. And there's many, many other outlets giving direct information on climate change, and they're all for the most part pretty small. Only a few institutions. Well, we'll get to media in a moment, but there's really no well-funded campaign to inform the public. Another really huge problem that's not talked about very much. There was some research done on this by Bergstrom. I forget his first name for the second, but that shows that ad-supported networks like Facebook and Twitter and those kinds of things, they make more money with more views. And it turns out that disinformation and controversial subjects create more views. So even though they might not even have a political reason, like they're not an ideology reason they want to promote disinformation about climate change, just to make more money, they do. Because the people that post disinformation gets more views, and they have algorithms that try to promote more views. And this has caused tremendous disruption in our society already. You could argue that Trump is president because of this, and many other issues regarding as we become dominated less and less by traditional media and more by social media. This is a huge, huge problem that Bergstrom says is as big a problem as climate change in terms of threat to civilization. And I think he's right. We talked a little bit about it, but the mainstream media has been nearly a total failure when it comes to climate change. And they certainly have their occasional story on climate change. The Guardian in the UK is maybe one of the best of the mainstream media to have consistent stories on climate change and giving fairly direct, discussion of the latest research and things like that. But they're the exception that proves the rule. And, for the most part, even the New York Times or something that does cover climate change occasionally, considering it's the biggest story of the century, it gets very little coverage. And one of the reasons is, it's something that climate change is something that's playing out slowly over time, and news wants something that's happening today. Getting back to our short-term thinking, by the way, that's what they're trying to cover. Are the whatever happened, today is much more important than something that's going to happen over the next months, years, and decades. Even academic institutions. Now, if you go and look at the climate research, almost all of it comes out of, well, not all of it, but very big chunk comes out of academic research institutions, and that's great. But when you really look at what the academic institutions are doing overall, they're focused on whatever the latest money-making technologies might be, and they downplay climate. And I know this since, as I mentioned, I went to Cornell undergraduate, and for the last 20 or so years, I've been meeting with the various presidents of Cornell, talking to different departments about the need to focus on climate change. I've been advisor to different colleges there, and always bringing up climate as such an important subject for the schools to cover. And I have to tell you, the message does not get through. They're again focused, hey, we need to bring in students. They're all interested in AI or whatever the latest thing was, because it's over 20 years. Whatever the latest thing is, we have to focus on that. And yeah, we're doing some interesting things on climate on the side over here. But I'm not singling out Cornell. This is something that plays across all universities. And again, it's people are focused on short term, and how are we going to keep the revenues up for the school for the next year, and things like that. And so that's, I think, a big problem. And again, academic institutions are thought of as being rational, looking at the science, not distracted like all other folks, maybe like Wall Street doesn't pay attention to science, but they do pay attention to science. They believe the science, by the way, yet they're still not able to act on it because they run into the same kind of short-term issues that all of us face. Another issue for climate change, we don't have well-known spokespeople. Yes, we have Greta Thunberg. We had Al Gore for a while, but we just don't really have, we don't have a Carl Sagan-like figure that's respected and trusted and eloquent and things like that. I mean, don't get me wrong. I think Greta did an amazing job from nothing to getting a lot of youth to rally around her and focus on climate, but there's not enough of that. And especially across different kind of tribes, like conservatives. I mean, Catherine Hayhoe, who we had on the program, comes from Texas. Her husband's an evangelical minister. She comes from a conservative background, so she's able to speak to conservatives more than most, but there's just not enough of that. And also, the public generally just doesn't know much about climate change or climate change solutions. They don't know that renewable energy is cheaper than fossil fuel energy. They don't know how serious climate change is, because no one's told them, by the way. And so there's just a lack of education going on. So let's go here. Let's get back to, sorry, we'll get back to tragedy, the comments. But so our whole economic system is set up incorrectly to address climate change. It's set up to subsidize fossil fuels, the thing that's going to kill us. And by the way, not to a small extent, but trillions of dollars a year. And there's a few exceptions to this, but there are small exceptions. There's no price on carbon. It's free to pollute the atmosphere with CO2. There are some prices in Europe and California and around the world a little bit, but not really enough to shift emissions. We also discount future damage, right? When we do economic calculations, we have a discount rate. So what happens 100 years from now is, a penny on the dollar today. So we destroy the world for your grandchildren, no big deal, because the calculations say that that's the good thing to do economically. And it's immoral, by the way. I mean, there's one thing to discount your own future, to say, hey, I'm going to have one pizza today instead of 2 pizzas tomorrow, that's fine if that's you. But if you're going to say, I'm going to have 2 pizzas today and my kids have 0 pizzas, that's now cross generational and that's immoral. But that's exactly what we do when we discount the future. Political and economic instability, partly caused by climate change, by the way, prevents the focus on the future. We have problems today we need to deal with, yet some of those problems, like for example, the Syrian crisis, the war, was caused by a 5-year drought. Not the only thing, but it was a big contributor, and that caused people to leave there, mostly go to Africa, but some of them went to Europe, and that caused a big crisis in Europe about immigrants and things like that. We talk about immigrants coming to the U.S. and we have to keep them out, and yet in South America, climate change is making it hard to survive there in some places, and so they want to leave and come here. That kind of thing, it gets us to focus on these near-term, immigrant threats and other kinds of near-term threats, and we want to focus on that rather than the longer-term problems. Another huge problem is, of course, nature is not valued in economic terms. When you're doing a calculation of something, you can just cut down a forest and you count how much money you made from the trees that you sold, but you don't have any negative impact for the fact that you just tore down a forest that was serving everyone. And that's just a basic thing that we do. And as other people have pointed out, the economy is a wholly owned subsidiary of nature. And so the fact that we don't treat nature as economically valuable is obviously a big problem. I don't need to point out that we have an economic system that requires, has incentive for continued economic growth. So getting back to the 3% a year example I gave before, that doesn't work in the long term. And certainly in the short term, we should be focusing on addressing climate change rather than economic growth at any cost. And that's not going to work out well for us. Misunderstanding of risk. This is a picture, if you don't recognize it, of the Challenger space shuttle blowing up 73 or 79 seconds after launch. The night before, they asked the rocket engineer whether they could launch, and he said, no, it's too risky. It almost blew up at 53 degrees or 52 degrees when we launched it the last time, and it's predicted to be 26 degrees tomorrow, so way too cold. The rocket's not designed for that. We can't launch. And the NASA people who wanted it to launch because there was a teacher going on the ride, and Ronald Reagan wanted to talk about that in his speech that was going to be that night after the launch. So they asked the engineer, can you prove that it will blow up? And of course, the answer is no, you can't prove it's going to blow up. But he just said it's not safe to launch. And so they asked him to leave and asked his managers to approve the launch, which they did. And then it blew up, of course. And the engineer tried all night to stop the flight. And he thought it would blow up on the launch pad and was very relieved when it didn't. But then it blew up quite soon thereafter. That's an example of what we're doing here. People are asking, can you prove that climate change will collapse civilization? No, but the risk is way too high. Well, okay, let's forget it then. And there, by the way, there's an example of this happening in the movie Don't Look Up, when the astronomers were in the White House talking to the president and the chief of staff and saying, look, the comet's going to hit the world for sure. And then the other person, well, no, it's actually only a 98.3% chance that it's going to hit the world. And then the chief of staff said, oh, so it's not certain then. So that's kind of what we're doing here. And then there's the tragedy of the comments. I'm going to expand on this a little bit. There were some illustrations by a guy named Kino Leon, and it's on a Medium post. And I think it explains it super well. You have a common field that cows are grazing on, and there's 4 farmers, each have their own little barn, and each have 1 cow, and that's enough for this piece of land for them to continually grow and prosper. But then one of the farmers thinks to himself, wait, if I had 2 cows, and look, we're sharing this land, but the food is free, and if I have 2 cows, I'm going to make more money. And hey, what's one extra cow going to do anyway? This is not going to be a big deal. So that farmer adds a cow, and well, the other farmers look at that and go, wait a second. And they all think the same way, of course, and so they all end up getting an extra cow. And of course, the land can't support all those cows, and so what happens is they all die. Now, the idea of tragedy of the commons is something that you do that is truly in your best interest. It was in the best interest of that first farmer to add a cow. And if that's all that happened and nothing else happened, yeah, maybe the land could support 5 cows instead of 4. That might have been fine. But when each individual does what's in their individual best interest, it's not the best interest of everyone. And that's what the tragedy of the commons is. Now, this is a simple example, but this is what's happening in the Amazon, for example, where anyone said, well, look, I'm going to grow some soybeans here, cut down some forests and grow some soybeans. Now, what's 100 hectares going to do? No big deal compared to the size of the Amazon. But if everyone does that, and everyone is doing it's actually really eating into the Amazon and causing it to tip over, and it might end up being a savanna, not just because of that, but also because of climate change. And so these are things where individuals make decisions and they screw everyone as a whole, including themselves. Again, you make that one decision, no one else follows your example, you're okay. But of course, everyone's thinking the same way you are, and that's what the tragedy of the commons is. Let's talk about political failures. Well, politicians have just failed totally. There's very, very few examples of leaders leading on climate. You could say Sheldon Whitehouse in the U.S. Senate, who gives a talk on climate, I think, every week. But of course, very few people are listening. I wouldn't say any presidents, including Obama and Biden, who spoke eloquently about climate change, both helped grow fossil fuel extraction in the U.S. under their leadership. And we're proud of it. It wasn't a mistake. And even in Europe, where again they speak, they're doing more than most. They just, not close to enough. China is interesting. Speaking of, we're going to talk about individual versus collective action. There, they believe in collective action. They're doing a lot to grow renewables at an incredible rate, but of course they're also the top polluter in the world of fossil fuel emissions. So there's just nothing really happening. And the reasons, the politicians have the wrong incentives. They're voted in over shorter periods of time, and like say U.S. president is 4 years. So long-term problems, not their thing. They just want to get elected the next time. And again, the public's focused on short-term issues. So there's no incentive to address climate change. There's also corruption, where the fossil fuel industry basically owns politicians through illegal, by the way, this is legal corruption, because these companies are allowed to give money, lots of campaign money, to these politicians. So these are, I'm sure there are some secret bribes under the table, but most of this is out in the open, and it's sort of official corruption, at least in our country. But all over the world, the fossil fuel industry basically helps fund the political class, and therefore they get control. And that's what the second thing says. The governments are tied to the fossil fuel industry. They're certainly dependent on fossil fuel revenues as a major part of their economies. Like check out Russia, for example. And this means that they get to call, the fossil fuel industry gets to call the shots. And there's a focus on future action. So, we better address climate change. Let's have a policy of net zero in 2050. Okay, now we did that. Let's go home now. Wait, what about doing something right now? What about beginning to phase out fossil fuels starting today? Well, no. That would be very disruptive. But I'm sure maybe in a decade or so, technologies will have been developed that will make the transition to net zero really seamless and easy, or something like that. So politicians will focus on the long term because they don't have to do anything now, but not actually act in the short term. And what we need is short-term action. Individualism versus collective action. Like in the United States, we believe every man for themselves. Everyone does their own thing. And this doesn't work well for climate change. You can't solve climate change individually. You can cut your emissions to zero tomorrow as an individual on a voluntary basis, and it will have no impact on climate change. I mean, maybe you can measure it out in the 10th digit or something like that. But it's not going to have an impact. And we need to act together on it. And yet, a lot of people are against the kinds of things where we act together. Of course, it's what made America great. We got to the moon. We did these other things. We won World War II. We did these things collectively. But again, there's a bias against that. And then there's another problem. As climate change gets worse and worse, there'll be a lot of cost of rebuilding. There'll be a lot of cost of required adaptation, maybe an emergency seawall or whatever it might be. And these things will get the government to focus on that rather than solving the long-term problem of climate change. And this is something that's already happening, but it's going to happen more and more as time goes on. So that's political failures. Inertia. Let's get back to inertia. Desire to maintain the status quo. Everybody wants to maintain the status quo. Unfortunately, the status quo is not one of the options available to us. And I should have put up the quote here from Kevin Anderson when he was on our show. But he said, the one thing I can say about climate change is that there are no non-radical futures. He said either the future is radically different than the present because we choose to make the changes necessary to address climate change, which includes social disruption, or we don't and we try to muddle along for a few more years, and then climate change itself causes massive disruption. So either way, the future is not radically different than the present. And yet there's a desire to maintain the status quo, and that's not one of the options available to us. So that's a problem. We have a lot of existing infrastructure. We have fossil fuel power plants. We have cement plants. We have airplanes that use fuel and fossil fuels, things like that, on and on and on. And we need to basically replace all of those. And we can, and we could even do it, relatively quickly over decades, but we haven't really even started. And then again, there's also just the fossil fuel infrastructure, the refineries, the drills and the wells and all of that, and the mines. And that's an enormous system in place. And that's very, very hard to shift away from because, again, all the political power, the economic power behind that. And that makes it very, very difficult. And then there's the interest of the few versus the benefit of the many. So first of all, the few, fossil fuel industry, Russia, Fox News, and others have active disinformation campaigns that they're funding about climate change and fossil fuels and things like that. And again, there's no one to counter that. The very wealthy and policymakers feel immune to climate impacts because they're wealthy. I mean, some of them are building or buying into doomsday bunkers, former missile silos or something where you can withstand a nuclear explosion, things like that. So they feel, hey, well, I'm covered, so what the hell? I mean, I don't have to worry about others. And again, the policymakers are they're usually wealthy themselves, and they feel in power to do to avoid these kinds of things. So they don't feel threatened like they should, and therefore they don't take the action that they should. High emitters of people flying in private jets, for example, they're the ones in charge of making climate policy. So we shouldn't be very surprised that getting rid of private jets is not high on their agenda, of things to do, as just one example. And as I mentioned earlier, fossil fuel companies own politicians. They give them campaign contributions and things like that. They dominate their economy in many cases. And so that makes it really hard for policymakers to do the right thing. And also the fossil fuel companies realize, hey, let's change the narrative to be that climate change is a problem of individual energy use. So they made carbon footprint calculators so you can calculate your own carbon footprint, and that made you the one guilty for climate change rather than them. And even so, it's is it individual energy use the problem, or is it dirty energy supply is the problem? Much easier to solve the problem by going after the dirty energy supply than it is by trying to convince individuals to use less energy. So, and then there's a group of just miscellaneous things. I didn't have a good category to put them in. First of all, green groups, or this is kind of true of progressive causes in general, is that every group has their own idea of what to do and they don't work together very well. So there's no coordinated plan among the green groups. That if there was a coordinated plan, it might be much more powerful, might be able to stand up against the well-funded fossil fuel groups, but that just doesn't happen. And there's also, if you really, read into what's happening on the climate forums and things like that, I call climate people concerned about climate change and want to do something about climate change. A lot of them spend a lot of their time criticizing other climate people, and especially criticizing climate solutions. So rather than spending their time focusing on the fossil fuel industry, which is doing the disinformation campaigns and bribing politicians, they say, hey, everyone who's working on carbon dioxide removal solutions, that's wasting resources, it's wasting time, that'll never scale. Look how tiny it is today. And of course, we could do a whole show on that. And then, of course, solar radiation management, we just did a show on last week, and we've done many shows on, is something that's probably necessary for survival. Yet there's a whole group of, quote, climate people that say, not only should we not do solar radiation management, we should ban solar radiation management research, which is a pretty crazy thing to say. But again, this is diverting attention from really solving climate change and focusing on the problem of what's causing climate change by, again, criticizing other climate people for working on climate solutions. And that's a big distraction. There's another one which I don't see talked about very much, but you see a lot of, climate people, again, saying the number one and only thing we should do right now is focused on emissions reduction and promoting renewables. And the reason we should do that is because every dollar that is taken away from that and goes to, let's say, carbon dioxide removal is not efficiently spent, because you can prove, and it would be true, to say a dollar spent on renewable energy development can reduce emissions, let's say, 10 times more than a dollar spent on carbon dioxide removal. Of course, so far, none of the dollars spent on renewable energy have reduced carbon dioxide emissions, because we know that, because carbon dioxide emissions are at an all-time high. You can say, oh, well, it's lower than it would have been. Well, okay, it's lower than it would have been, but it's not lower than it needs to be. And because of that, that's why we need carbon dioxide removal. But behind this statement is an assumption that there's a finite budget for addressing climate change, and any dollar spent on carbon removal, let's say, is a dollar not spent on renewables. And that's not true. There's no finite budget for saving civilization. Instead of taking a dollar away from carbon removal to fund, let's say, we need even more renewables. Well, first of all, they're cost effective, so you don't even have to fund them. That people do it anyway if they need energy. But let's just say more money was needed for renewables. Well, rather than taking that money away from carbon dioxide removal, why don't we take it away from building cruise ships? Cruise ships don't solve climate change. They contribute to climate change. And while they're a nice, fun thing to go on, they're not needed to save civilization. Why not take it away from golf cart manufacturing or Tupperware or making Marvel movies? We spend a lot of money on a lot of things that aren't required to survive, for our civilization to survive. And yet, for some reason, which I'm not 100% sure of, is we assume that there's this budget for addressing climate change, and you can't spend more than that. Anyway, okay. Let's now there is some. Whoops, sorry, got to get back here. There's concern that solutions will be unjust and not equitable. This is the social justice, climate justice movement. I think it's a great thing, by the way, because when you have a choice of where to build infrastructure for renewables or something, in the past, we've always taken the poor neighborhoods and put the worst stuff there. I think that's wrong, and we shouldn't do that. At the same time, we can't stop climate solutions to make sure that everything is perfect from everyone's point of view. And the reason is because the most unjust thing in the world is climate change. It's the most socially unjust. It's the most environmentally unjust. It hurts the people most who had the least to do with it. And so to whatever extent we allow climate change to continue unabated, it is the most unjust thing in the world. Nothing else comes close. And so we can't stop climate progress because we're concerned. We have to take social justice, environmental justice into account, and I'm all very supportive of that. But at the same time, it can't be used to prevent climate action. And then the other thing is we, fail to consider worst case scenarios. Look at the Space Shuttle Challenger, and then it happened again later in the space shuttle history for very similar reasons of just not taking into account risk and what the worst case can be. The worst case in this case is collapse of civilization, not in some very, very far off future, but perhaps within the lifetime of our children and grandchildren. And that's totally unacceptable. And if we understood that and we were concerned about that, like we are, but getting on an airplane, we're always, crashing, plane crashing is considered a worst case scenario. We're very focused on that. We minimize that. It's getting on a plane is now like the safest thing you can do in your life. But it's just, we just have the wrong way of thinking about all of this, of course. So it's summarized with this is fine, the way we're treating all of this. And I'm going to repeat a slide I used in the optimism bias presentation because I think it's very appropriate here as well. And that is climate change is a human systems problem. And it says climate inaction is not only explained by ignorance, stupidity, and evil, although that's part of it, but also by cognitive biases interacting with political and economic systems not designed for slow existential threats. That's what we're just covering here. But the thing about this is understanding this, and hopefully we can understand it, doesn't solve the problem. And as you'll see, addressing these points that I raised here, very, very difficult, but it has to be done. But it also helps explain why just knowing better, like knowing the climate science better, knowing that the ECS is really 4.5 degrees instead of 3 degrees. And that means we're going to hit 2 degrees by 2037 instead of 2050, and et cetera. Knowing all of this information is very useful. And for us, we understand what it means and increasing the level of urgency, but it's not affecting the public discourse. In fact, the public doesn't even know it, by the way. And it shows why we need to not only focus on climate science, climate solutions, but on our limitations, our irrationality of humans, and our limits of our the way we think and the way we act and our political and economic systems. So I hope that's helpful. I'm going back to please like and subscribe. Leave comments about what you think the most important of these issues I've raised. Which ones would you like to see maybe us do a deeper dive on? What did I leave out? What are some of these issues, social, psychological, economic issues that you think should be on this list? And thanks, and we'll let's see, get back to here, and I'm going to put this up and thank you here, and we'll get to questions in a moment. But so with that, I'm going to invite Stacey on. Hey, Stacey.
Hey, Dan. How are you?
What are the cats' names again?
This is Poppy, and this is Rocky.
Oh, my son's cat name is Poppy also.
What's that?
My son's cat's name is Poppy.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I'm a sucker for California poppies, even though he wasn't orange, but
Okay.
So this was great. I feel like it's so funny because I'm like, didn't we already do this one? But I guess
we did 2 years ago. It's called Barriers to Climate Action. It's a different take on it. But again, I think this is really, in some sense, the most important subjects we can be talking about. You're more important than the climate science and the climate solutions, even though those are very important. So I want to emphasize that, and also to bring, we have obviously a lot of new people listening to the channel now than we did 2 years ago. So a good time to go through it again and again in a different way.
Nobody goes back to the archives. I don't,
well, they do sometimes. When I look at the comments, you can look at all comments when you're on YouTube. You can go not just an individual show, and I see, usually it's the most recent show, of course, but I do see people looking at and commenting on a show we did a year ago or 2 years ago sometimes. But please do
Oh,
go look through them.
great.
We have over 100 shows, and on all different subjects. Again, on obviously in climate science, we have folks like Jim Hansen and Michael Mann and Catherine Hayhoe. We have all of that, but we also have people, psychologists and government people and things like that. So check all those out.
It's funny. You over 100 shows. I'm like, no, we couldn't have over 100, but we
Well,
probably do. We have over
50 a
100.
year
Just
for 3 years. I mean, we have
yeah,
more than that if you consider Clubhouse, but I'm not
yeah.
including
Which
Clubhouse. I'm just talking about YouTube programs.
reminds me, this month is 5 years.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah,
Started during the
crazy.
pandemic on Clubhouse,
Mm, the very dark
and
days.
then we switched. We did a few shows with a Zoom and Clubhouse, and then we
Hmm.
switched over to YouTube only. And I don't Clubhouse. I don't even know if it exists anymore.
I don't know. Yeah, they shot themselves in the foot.
Yep.
Um, there was well, I did want to in the chat, anyone getting trashed for riding their bike to work, please put their office in contact with me. I would be happy to speak to them about that.
Okay.
Um, and one of the things that you had mentioned, and other people, it's like, yes, for all our doomer friends watching, we would be better off, or the planet would be better off. We wouldn't, but the planet would be better off if we weren't around. And I understand that perspective. If you
Well, if
are in love,
anybody's interested in that discussion, go watch our number one rated show, Discussion with a Doomer with Elliot
Elliot,
Jacobson.
yes.
He's a doomer that believes in that. And I realized that while I was talking to him, so we had a discussion about that. I said, wait a second, you're saying not only are we doomed, but you want us to be doomed. And anyway, so check
Well,
that out.
and that's, I
Discussion with a
feel
Doomer.
obligated to tip my hat to him whenever we go into these, because he's right. It's I don't want to go along with it, because I want my
Well,
kids to have a
he's
chance, and
He's right if you
they're
assume that. I mean, you have to make certain assumptions. And if you believe that nature is more important than humans, by the way, these aren't absolute things in the universe. I mean, you can have that perspective and then you'll be right. If you value humanity, as some of us do, by the way, I'm not disagreeing that humanity is destroying nature. Believe me, and I don't think we should. But I would like to have a nice world for my children too, and
yeah,
that's a cognitive bias as well. By the way, there, there's other animals and things and species on Earth that we should be worrying a lot more about. Anyway, so
yeah.
okay,
And then the other was, a question that came up for me, about around the tragedy of the commons, and this, I feel like this is something I should know, and I don't. Does any nation is any nation sitting on a, you know jackpot, of oil, and they don't tap into it?
well, so far, I mean, there's new places being discovered all the time with tons of oil. I can't remember what the latest one was I read. So there's that, but and it takes a while to develop it. But I don't know. They have one that's been around a while and is well understood. I mean, let's take a look at Norway. They have the North
Yeah,
Sea, and they make tons and tons and tons of money. I think they have the largest sovereign wealth fund in the world for a small country like that, and they do more than anyone in terms of promoting EVs and green this, and they have carbon removal
have they
test
stopped
sites
drilling
and
the
everything.
oil?
They do all of that, but they don't stop pumping the oil, right? So
Same
I
with the
think that's maybe the
Dutch.
best example right there.
Same with the Dutch.
But I don't think the Dutch have as much oil as the Norwegians do,
Right.
just because of the geography.
But then I guess the thing, when you were talking about the tragedy of the commons, it got me thinking, and it was like, well, does anyone forego that? And that's the thing, that it's like, no one is showing the restraint. Just like in the Amazon, they're like, how can we make money? Everybody's getting more cows. And so they
Well, yeah,
clear cut so that they can have more cows. And it's just, it's
There
like
might be, by the way, there might be someone who's restraining on that, and that would be again the exception that proves the rule. You know, as opposed to
yeah.
so just having one example where someone's restraining
Does
themselves on oil production wouldn't prove anything. So
So if anybody has information on that, please post because I would love to know who's restraining themselves because it seems like no one is. And same with the people who set all the policy and the ruling class, the money. No one is changing anything they do. They just
okay.
do because they can. One of the questions
Well,
that
wait, before we do it, let's get Eli in on a question, and
oh
then
yes, yes,
let's go to a YouTube
yes,
question.
thank you.
So, hey Eli, welcome.
Hi, thanks. So a couple of things you just said, both of you just said that I wanted to comment on. First, the Dutch actually have a lot of natural gas, though they are eager to develop replacements for it. That's biomethane or hydrogen. And I'm applying for funding, which is why I know about that. But in terms of nature versus without us, if we develop the right technologies and we are serious about deploying them, we can actually enhance the restoration of nature better than just dropping off the face of the earth ourselves, and support even a larger population than we have at a better level of comfort, just by making all of those things the priority, and at the same time cleaning up the mess that we've made of the atmosphere. And in fact, all of those three things can actually go together. But this is just saying this to make the point that it's not just the things that you mentioned, all of which are important in terms of why we're not acting, but people are thinking about the problem in a very specific way, that it's this huge problem. Humans always do things wrong. We've outstripped the carrying capacity of our planet. We have, in the way that we have been exploiting our planet. We have not built an infrastructure to live in harmony with nature. The UK intelligence community just came out with a report this week that the ecological services that support our civilization and the UK in particular are at risk under current warming.
Yeah. But we, of course, the fact that we can live in harmony, but I'm pointing out why we won't until we address these issues. We're not going to be able to, not that we can't do it like in a theoretical sense, but we won't do it in a practical sense because of not just one issue, not just political corruption, which is obviously a big one, or disinformation campaigns from fossil fuel industry, which is a big one. But each one of these is a big one, and therefore we can't get the public to focus on restoring nature as a critical thing to do versus lower the price of gas at the pump or something, or make eggs more affordable or something. So that's the issue, right? It's not no one's talking here today about what we theoretically can do or not. Can we address climate change? Of course we can. Now, we let it go too far, so it's not like we can just make things the way they were. We can't do that, but we can prevent like collapse of civilization if we choose to, but we are choosing not to. And it is kind of a choice in a way, right? We know we need to do these things to avoid this. I mean, we being a few people understand it, and obviously not enough, but we're choosing not to. And I think that's the point of the discussion today.
But I think a lot of people don't have the framework to even imagine at this point that we can turn this huge problem that has built up literally over centuries, turn it around and be better off. That's
I know, but that's the whole discussion. What that's the whole cartoon. Well, what if we make the world cleaner and more prosperous and everything, and it turned out to be a mistake that climate change wasn't real, right? That's the old joke. But again, you're making an assumption right there I don't agree with. I don't think that most of the world actually knows. I mean, there's different knowings, by the way. If you ask somebody, climate change a problem, of course they're going to say yes, whatever. But to actually make it something that they're concerned about day to day? Very few people do. And therefore, very few people are thinking about what should we do about it, right? If they're not concerned enough to worry about it every day and to be and ask their elected leaders to do something about it, the choice of what to do, which you're saying there's these great choices, it's not even discussed. It's not like discussed and rejected. It's not even thought about.
So how do we turn that around? How do we get traction?
Well, the way we do that is addressing each and every one of the things on this list. Some of them that can't be addressed directly. Short-term thinking is just built into humans. You can't change that. But again, like dyslexia, you can maybe figure out ways around it where it's happening, and therefore you take other steps to do things. Like if you're always forgetting appointments or something, you can set alarms on your phone or something to remind you. So there's things we could do. A whole separate discussion here about things we could do to get around these things. But again, until we accept this problem as being really serious and needing of addressing, that also makes it hard to address these psychological and political and economic incentives. Obviously, what's one thing we could do is super simple, is stop subsidizing fossil fuels, the thing that's going to kill us. Seems to make sense. And instead, require the phase out of fossil fuels. That's super simple, could be done politically, could be done economically, could be done from a science and engineering point of view. We're not doing that. I mean, it's the most obvious thing. I mean, what else could be more obvious? Your continued use of fossil fuel is going to kill us all. Okay. Going to wipe out all our coastal cities in 7,500 years, maybe 50, some of them. And the obvious solution, I mean, there are many other things we'd have to do, but the super simplest one is stop subsidizing the thing that's going to kill you. Seems to make sense. And instead put that and turn that around and actually require the phase out of fossil fuels, which, by the way, would enormously grow renewable energy if you did that, right? You don't have to subsidize renewable energy. All you have to do is phase out fossil fuels, and renewables will fill it in. Super simple, super obvious, really hard to argue against that. Yet it's not just that we're discussing it and rejecting it. That's not on the table to even discuss. So anyway, let's move on and get some questions from the chat. Do you have?
Yeah, I just wanted to give some of the answers that were submitted to my question, which is Nevitz mentioned that Guyana is one of the latest target countries because of massive offshore oil discoveries. So Guyana, I guess, wouldn't have the wherewithal to do it themselves, but they will probably be the target. And going south, the Greenlander here reminded us that Greenland has restrained. And of course, I think someone else mentioned the thought I had, which is like, that's probably why we are interested in co-opting them as part of the United States, because there is oil there, I would guess. That we want to exploit. No war with Iran reminded the fact, which I will say all the time, about the U.S. had extracted the most oil and natural gas more than any nation in human history in 2023, 24, 25. U.S. is also the #1 exporter of LNG and gasoline. And and they also reminded us that science literacy is woeful in the United States and getting worse. We need the science teachers of the U.S. to rise up and demand the state governors and U.S. Department of Ed find climatology science classes, which is, yes, I totally agree. I just don't know if is anything fast enough. But I guess we have to, like everything else, we have to start doing it yesterday.
Okay.
Some of the questions we had. Reese said, Dan, do you engage with people like Michael Liebrick, essentially saying business is busy solving it and scientists lose their credibility? on how bad things are by using RCP 8.5?
Don't know him particularly, but that's a very classic thing. While RCP 8.5, just no, it's an emissions scenario. So when scientists try to predict future warming, it obviously depends on how much humans emit. We could stop emitting tomorrow. We could continue emitting at a rapid rate like we have in the past. And RCP 8.5 is supposed to be, quote, the worst case of continued coal use and whatever, and without continued fossil fuel emissions without restraint. Let's just say that. And people believe that we're not going to follow that path, and therefore these climate predictions are wrong. However, it turns out, emissions don't cause climate change, but the forcing from emissions cause climate change, and the forcing is going up at that rate, if not worse than RCP 8.5. In other words, even though emissions are, again, it's so short a time frame, it's hard to tell what emissions are actually doing. Are they following the worst case? Are they dropping off? But the forcing from it is continuing to rise at that worst case level. So therefore, we're going to have warming at the worst case level, and that hopefully answers that guy. I don't, but it's also bullshit to say that industry is solving the problem.
One other question I had that seemed like just a tee up for you was David asked, why has the Keeling curve continued in the same direction regardless of political party? The 80s looks the same as the 90s, as does 2000s, and so on. Why aren't Democrats better at climate?
It's actually not true. It's well, first of all, the U.S. is not the world, and the Keeling curve is global. And during that time, China was expanding greatly. And also, it's not true that it's going up in the same direction, of course, but it's actually accelerating. The ppm per year is increasing. It used to be 1.5, and now I think it's 3. Per 3 ppm per year, which is incredible. 1,000 times the natural rate of the past. So it is getting worse and what happens as the Earth warms, the Earth itself gives off more CO2, and therefore that helps accelerate the atmospheric CO2. And as the Earth warms, the sinks that absorb CO2, the oceans, lands, and soils, they absorb less, and so that also helps contribute to an increase. Why the Democrats? I tried to explain that. I mean, even under Obama and Biden, they increased fossil fuel production in the United States more than like any president, right? And again, not a mistake. They were proud of that, part of the all of the above energy policy that Obama promoted. So all the problems I talked about the politicians being owned, the Democratic politicians are maybe not as owned as the Republicans ones are, but they still are. I mean, for the most part, with some exceptions like Bernie Sanders and AOC and things like that. But for the most part, the economic tentacles of fossil fuel interests go across our political spectrum. And again, U.S. is, 1.8% of the land mass of the world, the United States, but it's 25% of emissions, which is huge because considering our population. But still, China's more than us and things like that. So we're not the only ones, number one, and two, the problems I laid out today apply to Democrats as well as to Republicans.
Okay. I missed 2 other responses to my question. And actually to Eli's response, Jeff said that the Dutch natural gas was shut down because extraction caused earthquakes. Otherwise, we'd still be pumping, which I know from being a former Pennsylvanian that where there's lots of LNG extraction and natural gas extraction that tremors like that do occur. And then some humpers from the UK, they said UK is sort of trying not to approve new licenses for drilling our oil, but I can't see it lasting as most political parties are losing their nerve.
Well, UK
is that right?
has in the past been approving new.
Yeah, I thought they were.
Well, But I don't know what they're doing right, maybe in the last year. But up until that point, I said, a saying I came up with is that it comes as a surprise to many, but it turns out you can't decrease fossil fuel emissions by increasing them. And that applies to what they
Yeah.
were doing, what the U.S. was doing under Obama and Biden. Hey, we're going to fight climate change. Well, you can't fight climate change by increasing fossil fuel emissions. I mean, you can't. And that cognitive dissonance is what they held in their brain. They felt, hey, I spoke about climate change. I'm concerned. We improved car efficiency numbers or something small like that. And yet for economic reasons, we better increase natural gas, LNG facilities, and pump and send natural gas around the world, which has natural gas has a warming coefficient that's 120 times that of CO2 while it's in the atmosphere. So, and then it's worse for LNG because now you have the energy to cool it to liquid form and to transport it and all that kind of stuff. So it's really bad stuff, and yet they were able to do that without blinking an eye.
One thing, our biggest cheerleader today, Calvin, environmental Canadian, asked, is Climate Chat aware that China's oil demand will peak within the next year or two and then quickly decrease?
There is a chance, and it might have been even happening this year or last year, that China's fossil fuel emissions in total have maybe dropped a tiny bit. I mean, not a lot, but even if it's anything negative at all, would be a huge step towards, maybe them hitting their net zero targets way ahead of what they said, which was like 2070, I think they said, or 2080, 2070, I think. But they're actually have a government that says, hey, we want to be the leaders in energy in the future. We like, for example, they just found out, Iran got bombed yesterday. And where was Iranian oil going? It was going to China. Where was Venezuelan oil going? It was going to China. So now they have two of their main suppliers cut off by the United States. They don't like that. They don't want to be in that position. They realize that running their cars on electricity, where they generate the electricity for free in their own country, using free energy supplied by the sun and the wind, that's a better deal. It's a more secure future, better economically, and then they get to dominate all these technologies and sell them to the rest of the world. And so they're being smart about that. But with that, maybe they'll actually turn around their emissions profile faster than others. But we'll see.
In
And then
contrast, Cuba didn't want to do anything about oil, and it's turning out rather catastrophic for them right now.
Yep.
Now, before this invasion, the thing in Iran was that Tehran was in danger of not having enough water due to climate change, and the disaster that's being set up now is for that to still be the case, and to not have a functioning government that can deal with Tehran water.
Okay.
Yeah. This next one is kind of a comment, but more to you, Eli. Eugene says, and I believe we all agree, humans are addicted to fossil fueled lifestyle. We are incapable of adopting an 18th century lifestyle. There's insufficient land, fish, and animals for 8.2 billion people to live off the land. And people like me would say, well, don't eat the animals, but go ahead.
Well, first of all, I think
yes.
the premise is wrong. We're not addicted to fossil fuels. We're addicted to energy, right? When you plug in your computer, do you really know which whether your electrons were generated by a coal plant or by wind and solar or batteries? I don't know which ones they are. And I don't care, right? I mean, actually, I want them to be wind, solar, and batteries, but I don't know which ones they are. If you drive an EV, once you drive one, you realize it's better than a fossil fuel car in essentially every way, especially nowadays. And you have 300-400 mile range, and it's cheaper to run. There's no maintenance issues. Battery lasts longer than the car. There's all these things, and So not only do I not care about having fossil fuel, I don't want a fossil fuel car. They're not as good. So, and you can start to do this throughout. Now, you still use cement. You don't use it directly necessarily, but infrastructure, you go to a mall or whatever it is using cement. We have to figure out ways to do that in a green way, and we can, but we have to require it. That's the other thing I didn't cover here. But why is climate solutions not scaling? They're not required. If you don't put a price on carbon, or at least phase out fossil fuels, why should anyone pay money to get rid of CO2 when no one's going to pay them for it? I mean, it doesn't. People think that carbon removal doesn't work because it's not scaling. It's not scaling because no one's going to pay for it. It's pretty simple. I mean,
well, no one's not going to pay. No one's going to pay for it when they get to externalize costs for free, right? And the UK Intelligence Service report is talking about how, well, actually we do depend on all of these ecological services to keep our civilization running comfortably the way it has, and we're destroying those, so we're not going to get that for free because we've been dumping our pollution for free. Right. Now, to the point of the comment, we have this apparent lock-in to fossil fuel dependent infrastructure that is being promoted by the interests that have been profiting fabulously from the way that infrastructure runs, and they don't want that good thing for them to come to an end. But we can absolutely build a better infrastructure on an economic basis when you consider all of the costs and damages that we face. But
of course we don't. But of course the answer is we don't do that. We don't factor in cost of nature. We don't certainly factor in future costs of climate damage, right? We just don't do that. And until we do it, which will require, by the way, one thing that could solve many of the issues that I talk about today is political leadership. We just don't have it. The one we had is the head of the United Nations, Gutierrez, right? And others. They say very directly, we have to do this. Is any global leader even listening to him? Not at all, right? It's like a lone voice in the wilderness or something. So we just don't have political leadership, and it's kind of hard to see much progress until we do have that. We had a chance, with Bernie Sanders, maybe, and maybe in the future we'll have with others that will take this subject. Someone's going to have to take it seriously as things get bad, but it certainly would be nice to have someone address it before it gets totally out of hand. But anyway, so with that, I want to just reemphasize that in the comments, especially for the recorded video, please leave comments of, which of the issues would you like us to see go more in depth on? What issues did we leave out that you think should be included? Again, if you, whatever that might be. And please like and subscribe and share the video with your friends. And I hope this is helpful. Again, we'll get back to these issues time and again, because again, knowing about the climate science, which we do a lot of here, is very helpful, but not enough. Knowing that there are climate solutions is helpful, but not enough. And there's not been enough focus, I think. Now, on individual issues we brought up, sure, people talk about them, but not as a collective thing. And I would really like to see that. And if you know of discussions of these collection of psychological, social, economic, political barriers as sort of a group or something, if you know of videos or websites that do that, please also put those in the comments. And with that, I want to thank Stacey and Eli. And by the way, get well to Leon, because I think he's a little under the weather today. So I hope he gets better fast. And again, next week, Eugene Kirpichov of Work on Climate. I think it's going to be a really interesting discussion for a lot of people to understand what this resource is. And check it out right now. Look up Work on Climate. And then also the week after that, March 15th, my birthday, Allison Taylor from NYU, who's an expert on business ethics and sustainability. and she has a book out and stuff like that. I think it's going to be a really fascinating discussion. And with that, I want to thank everyone, and we will see you next time. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.